You know, every day, civil servants across the federal government go to work for the American people. They ensure our constituents get their Social Security checks on time. They distribute resources in the wake of natural disasters. They strengthen our national security, and they help protect our borders. These people allow us to carry out the critical tasks of government. Right now, people are hired for the civil service because of their ability to do the job, not their political connections. They are career civil servants who serve across presidential administrations, regardless of the political party. This ensures that our civil service is highly trained and able to deliver for our citizens. But some presidential administration officials and organizations advising presidential administrations have pursued sweeping changes to the system. Most recently, the prior administration sought to replace at least 50,000 nonpartisan career civil servants with appointees who followed the former president's politics. This change would not only hinder our government's efficiency, it would be disastrous for the American people. It would drain the federal government of institutional knowledge, expertise, and continuity. It would slow down services, make us less prepared when disaster strikes, and erode public trust in government. Perhaps most importantly, it would weaken our national security and make us vulnerable to serious threats that continually face our nation. More than 70% of the federal workforce serves in defense and national security agencies. Proposals that would remove career national security experts in order to increase a president's political influence over agencies would hit hardest where the stakes are the highest. Regardless of anyone's personal opinion about the U.S. strategy for military engagement, diplomacy, intelligence, or disaster preparedness, we all want to trust that our leaders in these roles are informed with accurate, reliable, and complete information. This is especially true given the gravity of the decisions these leaders make each and every day in any presidential administration. We don't have to rely on hypotheticals to imagine what a personnel system under a president's political control would look like. In the 1800s, employment in the civil service was a patronage system based on rewarding people who followed the same politics. That led to a less effective workforce and one that was filled with unqualified, inept, corrupt, and focused on helping a single party rather than the best interest of the American people. Congress finally took action to end this system of cronyism in 1883, 2 years after President James Garfield was assassinated by a campaign worker who was denied a federal position that he felt entitled to. A century later, Congress took further action to strengthen hiring and firing protections for nonpartisan civil servants when Watergate documents revealed a Nixon administration blueprint for a plan to fire and replace civil servants across the government who disagreed with his politics. And that is why today Congress must take action to prevent a future president from using a statutory loophole to make thousands of civil servants fire-able based solely on the whims of a president's political leaders, and job security for civil servants would then be no longer tied to whether or not they meet the actual performance criteria. If their politically appointed boss decides to fire them for whatever reason, they would have no rights to appeal the decision. Civil servants would be exempted from the very protections that make them nonpartisan civil servants. The vast majority of American people prefer an independent civil service. There is a reason why civil servants take an oath to defend and to protect the Constitution rather than the political will of the president. Increasing the number of appointments by the president or the president's political leaders isn't even in the best interest of the political party in power at that time. Modern presidential administrations, they already struggle to fill nearly 4,000 appointments across the government each term. And increasing that number by 50,000 employees would hinder any president's agenda even further and likely lead to vacant jobs and disruptions to government services for much of that administration. These proposals are short-sighted, they're misinformed, and put political loyalties above effective service for the American people. We can and should consider ways to improve and modernize the way the federal government operates, including its personnel policies, whether it's making disciplinary procedures more straightforward to navigate or equipping agencies with better skilled-based hiring tools. My colleagues on this committee on both sides of the aisle have a deep and shared commitment to making the government more effective and making it more efficient and eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse. And we have a great track record of passing bipartisan legislation and conducting bipartisan oversight to do that. That is why Congress, working on a bipartisan basis like we do in this committee, must be involved with any type of reform to the civil service. It is also why we need to step in when a president of any party seeks to interfere with the independence of the federal workforce. Today's hearing is one important step in that mission. Our panel of expert witnesses will help us examine how to keep our civil service intact and suggest how Congress can take steps to improve it for future generations, especially when it comes to keeping our nation safe and secure. And I thank them for being here today and look forward to a productive discussion. It is the practice of this committee to swear in witnesses, so if each of you would please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Thank you. You may be seated. Our first witness is Elaine Duke, and Elaine is the principal of Elaine Duke and Associates, which provides federal management and acquisition consulting services. Ms. Duke has nearly 3 decades of service in the federal government. She was the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security from April 2017 to April 2018, while also serving as the Acting Secretary from July 2017 to December 2017. Ms. Duke also served as the Undersecretary for Management from 2008 to 2010. She was responsible for the Department of Homeland Security's $47 billion budget and $12 billion in their acquisition program. Ms. Duke, you are recognized for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Peters and members of the committee. I really appreciate being here today. National security is of utmost importance, and I'm pleased with the committee's work on this topic. Today, we are not focused on if anything needs to be done to improve our national security policy, but how we ensure that that is done. There's so many complex issues facing our country today: the election security and increased threat, fentanyl, human trafficking, the PRC, and supply chain, just to name a few in the national security area. I'm opposed to any decision that has high potential to undermine effective national security policy and operations. I am concerned that Schedule F will do just that. My experience leads me to believe that any up-tempo of producing policy will be far outweighed by its disruptive downside of less effective policy, and that's why I oppose Schedule F. Here are some of the areas that I'd like to address to the committee today. First, and maybe least important, other than if you're a fiscal conservative like me and will always think about that incremental dollar, it's a tremendous administrative burden. We have not only the designating of the Schedule F workforce, but an annual review by every single agency in the executive branch. And I think this diverts needed resources from national security to administering Schedule F without the benefit of doing so. And it could consume all the efforts and stagnate any forward progress. Second, as you said, Mr. Chairman, is it blurs political and career workforce and accepted service schedules. Schedule F creates yet another Title V accepted service. I'll argue that the vast majority of civil servants are doing their job, and even Schedule F proponents agree with this. Policy personnel are using their knowledge, skills, abilities, and experience to deliver results. They attempt to influence the policy process to make the outcome better. But once the decision is made, they faithfully implement lawful policy and direction. For the few that is not the case, the current system allows leaders to appropriately deal with those performance or behavior issues. It's important to note that as I read through the examples published by the proponents of Schedule F, I noticed that the vast majority were attorneys. Attorneys are already accepted service in Schedule A for most Title V agencies. And I think this is just another example of why we don't want to just do a approach of adding another accepted service. Another issue is government ethics and responsibilities. Under Title V, employees must endeavor to act at all times in the public's interest, avoid losing impartiality or appearing to lose impartiality in carrying out official duties. I think this is an important tenet of our federal system for the people, for our country, and for national security. I believe there is too much ambiguity in the scope of Schedule F. When we read most of Schedule F, it talks about confidential policy making, policy determining, or policy advocating. It's important to note a few specifics here, and one is the word "or," which means that anyone that deals with anything confidential could be exempt, could be put under Schedule F at the discretion of a current administration. And I think that's really dangerous to have that much ambiguity. You want some level of discretion, but not that level of ambiguity. Additionally, under Section 5 of Schedule F, it introduces an element of operations by saying substantial discretion to determine the manner in which the agency exercises this function. So with that exception, you're going from policy making to exercising policy, and I think that's an ambiguity that's dangerous. Another one is viewing, circulating, or otherwise working with proposed regulations. Again, this adds an element of the workforce that I don't think those that support Schedule F really think about how big and broad that could be implemented at the discretion of an administration. And then at the end, it throws in conducting collective bargaining agreements. I'm not sure why, because it's very different than the others, but also, to me, evidence that we're throwing in so much ambiguity as to be dangerous and at minimum not transparent to our people. My biggest fear is that we will not have the vetting that you talked about, Senator Peters, the input, the coordination of key stakeholders to have effective policy. And I look forward to taking your questions throughout the morning. Thank you.
Thank you. Our second witness is Peter Levine. And he is a senior fellow at the Institute for Defense Analysis, where he focuses on defense management, organizational reform, human resource management, and acquisition policy. Mr. Levine was the acting Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness at the Department of Defense from April 2016 to January of 2017, and the Deputy Chief Management Officer from May of 2015 to April of 2016. He served on the staff of the Senate Armed Services Committee from 1996 to 2015, including 2 years as staff director, and also previously served as counsel to Senator Carl Levin and as counsel to this committee. Mr. Levine, you are now recognized for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Peters, and thank you, members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here this morning, and I appreciate your addressing this incredibly important issue. When I was appointed acting Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness about a decade ago, Secretary Carter had an ambitious agenda for me. He wanted me to help him revitalize the DoD military and civilian workforces by implementing his Force of the Future program. I could not have made any progress on in this effort without the deep expertise of the civilian career employees in my office. The very first step that I took after being appointed was to meet with my new team and tell them how much I needed their help and look forward to working with them. They had deep technical knowledge and decades of managerial experience on every issue that would come before me, from military recruiting and civilian hiring to National Guard duty status, from training and education programs to retirement benefits and family assistance programs. They played two key roles in everything that I did. First, before I made any proposal to the Secretary, I consulted with my senior managers and gave them a chance to provide input. If they had questions or concerns, I wanted to hear them. I didn't want to get caught with not understanding what the implications of a proposal were and then having it break later down the road. I wasn't going to let anybody on the staff dictate policy decisions, but it was important for me to understand the implications of what I was doing before I did it. I firmly believe that our actions were more effective and more enduring as a result of this consultation. If a leader isn't confident enough in himself to consider a range of views before acting, perhaps that person shouldn't be in a leadership position at all. Second, once the Secretary and I had made a decision, our senior career civilians were essential for carrying it out. They were the ones who knew what documents we had to draft, what had to be included in a memo or directive or instruction, how the documents had to be directed and coordinated and approved, who had to take additional steps like issuing component-specific supplemental guidance and initiating training initiatives. Without their expertise, the levers of the department simply would not move, and a well-intended policy initiative would change nothing. This two-step approach is consistent with the role that civilians are expected to play in the federal government, career civilians. They owe political leaders their best advice, but once a decision has been made, it's their duty to carry out that decision. The ability of career civil servants to provide open and candid advice without losing their jobs enables political appointees like me to benefit from their knowledge and expertise, and the knowledge and expertise that they've developed at government expense that we've paid for and they've developed over a career. We benefit from that and make better decisions as a result. But at the same time, their duty to follow orders means that our government remains responsive to the political leadership, the political appointees who represent our nation's citizens. In one case that I'm aware of, a new political leadership team became enamored of a contractor's proposal to replace an existing business system with a new software-as-a-service model. The senior civil servants who'd seen this movie before told them that their belief that this could be done in no time and at minimal expense was completely unrealistic and inconsistent with the department's experience. As somebody who's viewed this over 20 years, I can tell you that career civil servants were right. The political appointees went ahead with the decision anyway, and the career civilians did what career civilians do. They implemented the decision. They did their best to make it work. Many years and hundreds of millions of dollars later, they're still trying to make the decision work. But the point is, as wrong as they might have thought the decision was, they knew it was their duty to implement it. On the other hand, I believe there's very little risk that career civil servants will fail to carry out a directive from political leadership. I'm aware of multiple instances in which policy decisions of an outgoing administration have been reversed by an incoming administration. In each case, the career civil servants who carried out the old policy deferred to the department's new political leadership, seamlessly carrying out the new policy. In short, the risk that political appointees will fail to listen to the informed views of career civil servants is far greater than the risk that civil servants will fail to carry out a directive from political appointees once it has been made. We live in a time of deepening social, political, and cultural divides in American society, but we all have a shared interest in the security of our nation. Nobody is more committed to this shared interest than the senior civilians who have devoted their careers to the Department of Defense. As one who spent his own career endeavoring to make the department work better, I appreciate the continuing need for change and for reform. However, I firmly believe that any change agenda will be stronger and more successful in the long run if it treats the dedicated career civil servants in the department as allies, not enemies. Thank you for inviting me here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Our third witness, Jenny Mattingley, is the Vice President of Government Affairs for the Partnership for Public Service. She oversees the strategic direction for the partnership's government affairs and advocacy efforts, focusing on improving and modernizing government management and services for the public. Ms. Mattingley has previously served in the executive branch at the Office of Management and Budget, focusing on hiring reform efforts and the workforce priority of the President's management agenda. She also served as the executive director of the Performance Improvement Council and spent many years overseeing policy for the Senior Executives Association. Ms. Mattingley, you are now recognized for your opening comments.
Thank you, Chairman Peters, and thank you, members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm with the Partnership for Public Service, a nonpartisan nonprofit that is focused on making government work better for over 20 years across 4 administrations. While there are so many things we could discuss today about making government more effective, I'm going to focus on 3 areas: the importance of a nonpartisan professional national security workforce, public perception of our government and what people want from it, and rebuilding trust by ensuring an effective government through investments in modern management practices in the same way the private sector does. There are many untold stories of the work that federal employees do on behalf of our country, from taking down drug traffickers and crime syndicates to combating terrorism to ensuring our cybersecurity. These stories barely scratch the surface of the critical work that thousands of federal employees do to make our country safer and stronger. Of the approximately 2 million federal employees, nearly 71% work at defense and security-related agencies, and approximately 30% are veterans who choose to continue service to country by working for the federal government. In many of your states, national security functions, such as the Air Force and the VA, are the largest government facilities and employ your constituents. National security employees are professionals, experts in their field working on complex issues where relationships built over time and institutional knowledge are critical. Across administrations, they provide continuity and stability, carrying out the laws and policies directed by Congress and administrations. If guardrails preventing hiring and firing career employees for political reasons are removed, this in effect creates another category of political appointees at a much larger scale. Each president can already fill approximately 4,000 political appointments in positions in agency leadership to lead implementation of the president's agenda. Already, it is tough for a president to fill that many political positions, particularly those that are Senate confirmed. Many of you have heard the partnership's research on the increasing difficulty of the confirmation process and the performance challenges that leadership vacancies cause for agencies. Having an increased level of turnover every 4 years would exacerbate this challenge. It's one we already see during presidential transitions. Many new administrations face significant national security challenges early into their first year in office. Having nonpartisan career professionals who serve across administrations in place, ready to provide the expertise and deal with these challenges, is necessary to our country's safety and security, particularly when a president doesn't yet have a political team in place. Just having people in place isn't the only ingredient to success. Our trust research shows that Americans overwhelmingly want a government that works for them and that isn't beholden to one party or president, but focused on serving the public. According to a nationally representative sample of individuals across the political spectrum from a survey conducted in 2024, there's a crisis of public trust in government. But people don't want a more partisan federal workforce. 95% agreed that the civil servants should be hired and promoted based on merit rather than their political beliefs. 72 disagree with the idea that presidents should be able to fire any civil servant that they choose for any reason. And 90% agree that a federal government that functions effectively is important for a strong democracy. This brings us to my point about reform and being laser-focused on making overdue investments to ensure our government is effective in its work. Let's be clear. While the vast majority of employees are doing good work on behalf of their agencies, we are talking about people, and that means there are some who are underperforming, some who engage in misconduct, and some who need to be fired. This happens in every industry across the private sector, too. When we talk about hiring, firing, and employee performance, we are talking about inherently human capital functions that all businesses deal with, and one that comparably large companies invest in because getting those things right is critical to their bottom line. For leaders, both career and political, to be successful, they must understand and prioritize accountability and strong employee performance. Unfortunately, in the federal government, we haven't made the same investments in these systems, and the cracks are beginning to show. Many of the laws governing the federal workforce are from the 1950s and 1970s, with only minor updates over the years. Often the focus is on programs, not mission-enabling functions like HR and IT, that are so desperately in need of prioritization and modernization. This includes the employee performance management process, which needs to be fixed. There are many other places where smart investments and updates will yield the results we all want, effective services for the public and for our country. I outlined several options, such as developing leaders, reforming the hiring process, and focusing on customer experience in my written statement. I look forward to working with you on these critically important issues and to answering any questions you have today. Thank you.
Thank you. Our fourth witness is Tom Devine. He is the legal director for the Government Accountability Project, a position he has held since 1979. During that time, he has assisted over 8,000 whistleblowers, has been on the front lines for passage and oversight of 37 whistleblower laws, and has spoken in over a dozen countries as the State Department's informal ambassador of whistleblowing. He is also an adjunct professor at DC Law School and has authored numerous books and law journals. Mr. Devine, you're recognized for your opening comments.
Thank you. My testimony analyzes Schedule F, but I think I've been invited to share a history lesson because history repeats itself. Schedule S is a deja vu structure for the Malek Manual, a comprehensive Nixon administration plan to replace the civil service system with a political spoils system. For perspective, attempts to engage in political control of the federal labor force are a timeless bipartisan tradition. Government Accountability Project has as active a whistleblower docket under President Biden as we did under President Trump. Schedule F, however, stands out. It is a structure to openly do what President Nixon tried to accomplish in secret. The fundamental question is, does the merit system serve or undermine government service? The Malek Manual emphatically answers that question. Quote, there is no merit in the merit system, exclamation point, unquote. This is due to lengthy red tape procedures that cause litigation, burdens, delays, and bad publicity. And Schedule F has a similar justification. These are inadequate excuses for a political spoils system. Despite its messiness, the merit system has served the public well. Just consider the track record of whistleblower protection, a merit system cornerstone. My written testimony has numerous examples where whistleblowers have changed the course of history by overcoming government breakdowns that threaten national security, our freedoms, our public health and safety, over and over again. This could not have occurred if they did not have the merit system freedom to expose the truth. But Schedule F would turn the Whistleblower Protection Act into a bad joke. You know, on paper, the rights would still exist, but for enforcement, the Independent Merit Systems Protection Board would be replaced by agency self-policing. This means that the same agencies, which for 45 years have been defendants in personnel cases, now will have an honor system as the organizational judge and jury of their own alleged misconduct. Let's review the Malek Manual. Literally, its goal was a federal labor force of, quote, loyal troops, unquote. As it explained, political disloyalty, unfortunately, is not grounds for removal or suspension of an employee, unquote. It listed two explicit objectives. Overriding goal, quote, firm political control of the department or agency. Second, quote, maximum political benefit for the president and the party. The bottom line, quote, reasonably guarantee the appointment to positions of candidates who are clean with respect to previous political activity, national security matters, etc. Although labeled for non-career positions, in practice, it was used extensively in the competitive service. Agencies had to demonstrate compliance with a political rating system for new hires. Must, priority, courtesy, political undesirable, or political problem. Consider how must placements were defined. These were for hiring that would, quote, bring great political credit to the party or the president, while conversely, failure to place the individual will cause severe political damage to the party and or the president. For long-term oversight, every agency had to have an abstract outside of normal political records that would track each employee's political activities. In other words, a patronage dossier. For infrastructure, the manual created a detailed step-by-step blueprint for White House political control through personnel actions. Every agency would have a political personnel office, separate from the personnel office, staffed by a special assistant reporting to the White House who would forward politically cleared candidates to the personnel office to do the paperwork. As observed in the manual, in this way, the deck is essentially stacked before the cards are dealt, and rarely is a selection disapproved. The operation had an R&D branch who is charged with determining positions where, quote, loyal incumbent is, quote, necessary to effect control. It would include employees whose jobs included communications with the media, Congress, or those controlling disbursement of resources. This function could easily be applied to create newly designated confidential policy jobs under Schedule F. Incumbents had to be removed to make room for political hires. My written testimony has a menu of the dirty tricks to force people out of the government, as well as illustrations of how this has affected public service, and recommendations for how we can improve government service without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Mr. Chairman, the ways to improve accountability is not by replacing the law with no accountability for absolute political power that can be abused.
Well, thank you. Certainly nonpartisan civil servants must be hired and they must be retained because of their ability to actually do the job effectively based on objective performance standards, and those standards stay in place regardless of who is serving as the president. So my question for you, Ms. Duke, is compared to appointees who serve at the pleasure of the president, what role do civil servants play in helping a presidential administration secure the border, respond to natural disasters, as well as defend against threats from abroad?
I would say there's two principal roles in regard to the topic of this hearing. One is to inform policy. So with years of experience, I think that it's important for civil servants to understand the policy objective and help inform it so it can be tailored to be most effective. The second role that civil servants have is executing the policy, and I think that's tied to the first because we learn a lot through execution of policy. So what works and what doesn't work. So if we have a policy on constructing a physical barrier, like you said, Senator, how can that be done effectively? And what things do we have to consider in doing that? So I think it's an informing and an executing role.
Were there national security issues or natural disasters during your time in the federal government where you especially relied on career civil servants to help and develop a response? Could you give us an example that may come to mind?
Yes, consistently, both as a senior executive service career, relying on junior people, but then also as a two-time political appointee. You know, one example was I was at the start of President Obama's administration, we had H1N1, which was the first COVID, if you will, never came to the extent. And really talking to the civil servants about what can we do to prevent the spread in Homeland Security, the use of personal protective equipment, how do we deal with antibiotics, but really having to understand the workforce and how we could stop the spread of this. Another example more recently, when I was back in government, is making decisions on temporary protective status. Not only what's the letter of the law in terms of deciding whether to extend temporary protective status, but what implications could that have across other areas of government so that we make the right decision, but also deploy that decision, if you will, in the most effective way.
Very good. Mr. Levine, what types of risk from the U.S. defense of perspective would be heightened if the department lost access to the expertise that is unique with career civil servants?
Well, there's really nothing that the department does that it does without, other than actual operations on the battlefield, nothing that it does without the direct involvement of civilian employees. And even on the battlefield, you have employees in a supporting role. So the logistics systems of the department, the communication systems of the department, the acquisition systems of the department, the personnel systems of the department, all run with a substantial input by the expertise of the civilians. If you didn't have that expertise, you'd be hard pressed to get our service members paid. You'd be hard pressed to get their families taken care of, and you'd be hard pressed to equip and train our soldiers so they could operate in the field. So there is no aspect of the department's operations that does not have civilians, DoD civilians embedded in it, and that relies on deep expertise. And you could put in other people to do it, but without the expertise that you have there now, I worry that the functioning would not be as good. It would start with the budget process. The budget process, putting together a budget in the Department of Defense, an $800, $900 billion budget, is an incredibly complex process. And we tend to think at a political level of a few major issues that overarch, that have heavy political weight, but there is a lot of detail going down to going down to the $100,000, $10,000 level and putting together the pieces and making sure they fit together. And again, civilians play absolutely critical role in that process, and without their expertise, I don't know that you'd be able to fund the department.
Well, I just follow up on that. It's important to put in perspective the Department of Defense is the largest federal agency in the U.S. government, and it employs, this is the number, 700,000 civilian employees, a massive organization. So my question for you, and you raised this in your opening comments, in your experience in leadership roles at the Department of Defense, including as the principal advisor on personnel policy and management, did you personally experience or observe career civil servants acting in a partisan way to block the president's political goals?
I never saw that happen, no, sir.
Ms. Duke, the Department of Homeland Security is the third largest cabinet department in the U.S. government. And my question for you is, in your experience as Deputy Secretary and Acting Secretary during a Republican administration, to what extent did you observe insubordination by civilian public servants?
I did not observe that by our civil servants.
Mr. Devine, whistleblowers play an integral role in providing oversight for the federal government, ensuring that fraud, waste, and abuse is identified. And certainly I think all of us on this committee understand the importance of whistleblowers and continually work to protect their status. So my question to you is, to what extent do you think converting civil servants to appointees serving at the will of a president's political leadership would actually impact the willingness of whistleblowers to come forward? I know you talked about this in your opening comments, but I think it's important to really drill down as to what that impact will be.
Mr. Chairman, I think some examples might be helpful to illustrate their impact. Whistleblowers at the Department of Defense stopped the routine purchase of the world's most expensive nuts, bolts, toilet seats, coffee pots, and other items that were purchased. They stopped blanket domestic surveillance, working through the Department of Defense Office of Inspector General and sparking passage of the USA Freedom Act. They forced delivery of mine-resistant vehicles that have been held up due to political obstruction and reduced the number of fatalities, which were 90% in Iraq and Afghanistan, and 60% casualties from landmines to 5% casualties from landmines. They prevented the federal air marshals, for example, from going AWOL during a confirmed, more ambitious al-Qaeda rerun of 9/11 back in 2003. They prevented the trillion-dollar next phase of Star Wars after the Army's chief scientist, a career employee, exposed that that billion-dollar investment would have been irrelevant for the nation's defense. Over and over again, they've changed the course of history. And they couldn't have done this without the Merit System's freedom of speech.
Thank you. Senator Blumenthal, you're recognized for your questions.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to you and to our witnesses for this hearing. I've been a longstanding advocate of protection for whistleblowers, and in the course of my experience here, as well as State Attorney General in Connecticut and federal prosecutor, I've seen the importance of whistleblowers to protecting everyday Americans. I have introduced the Congressional Whistleblower Protection Act, which aims to strengthen the safeguards not only for federal employees, but also for contractors and others. Those safeguards, in my view, need to be strengthened. And I'd like to hear from you, all of you, but perhaps beginning with Mr. Devine, in light of your extensive experience with whistleblowers, where the areas are greatest in terms of need for strengthening those protections.
Excuse me. Senator, I think the primary improvement is to strengthen the administrative law system by creating a safety valve for the whistleblower cases. These are extremely complex, burdensome disputes that are a major drain on the board's resources, and I think a significant factor in the really inexcusable backlog that's caused multi-year delays in people seeking justice. The government contractor law, the corporate laws, and all state and local employees have access to court for jury trials when there's free speech retaliation is the issue. The civil service employees in the federal government are the only ones who don't have that right, and they're probably the ones who need it the most because the administrative law judge system is vulnerable to political pressures. We need to get them into court where their freedom of speech rights can be judged by a jury of the citizens whom they were purporting to defend when they risked their professional lives for the same goals that Schedule F purports to be advancing.
Any of the other witnesses have perspectives on that topic? Levine.
Senator, I worked with Mr. Devine decades ago on an earlier version of the Whistleblower Protection Act, so it's an issue I feel strongly about, but I'd like to give us a slightly different perspective. Of course, a right without a remedy is not going to do you any good. But it's important to understand that the laws alone are never going to be enough to protect whistleblowers, that there are 1,000 invisible ways that a hostile work environment can make things unpleasant for a whistleblower, and reasons why a whistleblower's path will always be difficult. And so to me, the most important thing that can be done for whistleblowers is to set the tone from the top, from the top of the administration, from the top of a cabinet department, from the leadership of the department, that we're open to views, that we want to hear views, we want to hear problems with programs, that we don't want to shut down conversation, we don't want to shut down debate. And that's a reason, frankly, why the idea of a Schedule F is particularly problematic, because it sends the opposite message. So I just want to make that point.
And in addition
Ms.
to what my colleague said, I would like to strengthen the Whistleblower Protection Act by reducing its need. And I know that sounds counterintuitive, but having the real cases, strengthening that need to go to the act, but strengthening performance management within the federal civil service sector. So the need for it is really a smaller minority of people. Training and teaching, as I talked about in my written testimony, supervisors to be supervisors, leaders to be leaders, so that the vast majority of cases could be avoided through the meaningful discussion and conversations that Mr. Levine talked about.
Ms. Mattingly?
Thank you. I'd just like to add on to that is that one of the things that we see often across federal agencies is an ad hoc or sometimes often cut training budgets, leadership development budgets. These are not things that we do in terms of really developing our workforce and our leaders. So to do the things that we talk about, creating good environments, creating a good culture, a strong leadership culture, in the private sector, especially at large companies, you see a lot of investment in that employee piece and that leadership. And so we would encourage look at how we can strengthen those things within the government as well.
I think all these observations are very well taken. I think the point about leadership and management encouraging whistleblowers to come forward is, really a measure of how well the federal government is doing in terms of those basic management skills, because a good manager should be receptive to constructive criticism, and the top-down encouragement of criticism and open conversation, discussion, I think is tremendously important. But at the same time, the laws do help to set a tone, even if they are difficult to enforce, even if whistleblowers inevitably make sacrifices, even with the best laws when they come forward. But I think many of our whistleblowers are the heroes of better management, and I think we can better protect and safeguard their rights. I want to ask, just briefly in the time I have left, whether any of you have any observations about the issues of surrounding the importance of civil service employees in cases of natural disasters, whether it's FEMA or other agencies being involved. In Connecticut, we recently had major flooding in towns, small towns, Seymour, Oxford, Middlebury, number of other towns in Connecticut, Litchfield, Fairfield, New Haven counties, and I was impressed by the civil servants who came from FEMA and other agencies to help us, as they have in other times of natural disaster, and I'm sure they have in other states as well. And we're awaiting, hopefully, a declaration of major disaster in our state. Maybe you could comment on the importance of civil service employees in responding to natural disasters.
Yes, in Department of Homeland Security, I had the pleasure of leading FEMA, and I agree with you 100%, Senator. The dedication and passion of those men and women in FEMA from before a disaster is even declared and they stand up the National Response Coordination Center to delivering service, staying wherever they need to stay. In the case of the 2017 hurricanes when there weren't facilities, staying in people's garages and working 12 hours minimum a day for months and months on end. It's an amazing workforce, and it's supplemented by a contingent workforce that only comes on when the need arises, that are equally dedicated to health and safety of our people.
Yeah, I've been tremendously impressed over the years by the dedication, whether it's in Puerto Rico after the hurricanes there, or in Connecticut or elsewhere in the country, by the dedication of our civil service employees. Thank you all for being here and to your work on this very important issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Well, currently, there are nearly 4,000 political appointee positions throughout the federal government. Most presidents, let's be very clear, most presidents have a very difficult time filling a majority of those positions. They are left unfilled. And so my question, and I'm going to ask Ms. Duke and Mr. Levine and Ms. Mattingley to respond to this. So adding at least 50,000 more political positions, as proposed by the advocates of Schedule F, I believe would undoubtedly result in a higher number of vacant positions at these agencies. So if each of you could address, we'll start with Ms. Duke and work down, what would the impact be of all these massive unfilled positions? What's this going to mean for the American people and the work that needs to get done? So put it in terms that folks will understand what this could mean. Ms. Duke.
I think the impact is, in the Department of Homeland Security specifically, what needs to get done will get done at the minimum levels. But what you don't do is you don't drive forward excellence, and you don't drive forward the growth of having a strong Homeland Security department. So in DHS, we've had Senate confirmed. There's only, I believe, 18 or 19 Senate confirmed. Those, several of them have been vacant. So I think it's important that we will ensure, the civil servants are so dedicated, they'll ensure that life and safety is taken care of. But what won't happen is excellence, and our country deserves excellence. And the vacancies definitely contribute to our ability to drive forward to excellence in Homeland Security.
Mr. Levine.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I would guess there are roughly 30,000 or so people working in the Pentagon every day. So I would guess that perhaps 10,000 or so would be covered by the Schedule F proposal. It's just a guess. I don't think the department did the work or did the analysis to figure out exactly which positions would be covered. I'd like to put that in the context of what happens in a presidential transition, because if the president who first imposed Schedule F would probably figure, I can replace people over time, it's not going to be there's not going to be any great discontinuity. The problem is, if one president replaces 2,000 or 3,000 or 5,000 or 10,000, then the next president's going to come in and feel that he or she can't rely on those 2,000 or 3,000 or 5,000 people. So you're going to have it. Right now, what happens in a presidential transition is all the political appointees leave, and it takes a long time to bring in new people. It takes 6 months to a year to bring in the critical core of people that you need at the political level to run the Department of Defense. During that period of transition, the handful of the handful of political people who come into the department rely on those career civilians who have the experience, who can keep the lights on and keep things running during the period before they can get more politicals in. So if instead of having to replace a few hundred political employees and being able to rely on the career employees, you had to replace 2,000, 3,000, 5,000, 10,000, you wouldn't be able to keep the lights on during that transition. You wouldn't be able to run the building if you fired the people who you felt were political hacks who were brought in by the previous administration, and you wouldn't know who you could turn to, who you could rely on. That would probably also have an impact on the civil-military relations in the department and the balance between civilians and military in the department, because the department is unique, of course, in having a huge military workforce with senior military. And what happens when you have an absence of civilian leadership is the military just by default takes on bigger roles. So you would, in some ways, you would risk really undermining civilian control over the military, at least during this transition period, while you didn't have civilians you could rely on to run the department.
Thank you. And Ms. Mattingley, what are your thoughts government-wide, what this would mean?
Yes, one of the things we've seen, and we have at the partnership a Center for Presidential Transition, so we work a lot on a nonpartisan basis with candidates, campaigns, and administrations across both parties. But what we hear overall is that it is difficult to bring these folks in. You mentioned 4,000. That's both presidentially appointed ones and then over 1,300 that require confirmation of the Senate. I've heard one former political appointee say it feels a little bit like it's in neutral gear, agencies are, because they do not have those top-level leaders in place to kind of direct the policy of the incoming administration. You also have people sitting in acting positions, and oftentimes when they're acting, they're wearing 2 or 3 hats. So they're doing 3 people's jobs under one person, and so that just makes it hard to make the longer-term decisions, makes it hard to think about reform, makes it hard to prioritize each of those individual jobs. We also see that relationships with Congress, especially as Congress is doing its oversight role when there aren't political appointees in place with the authority to speak on behalf of the administration, that also sometimes makes it a challenge. And so these vacancies can be hard as well on employee morale. People look to their leaders to direct the agencies, and so not having leadership in place can certainly be a drain on morale, which just impacts agency operations. But on a day-to-day basis, I agree, career employees are running the day-to-day implementation of work, but that leadership is important to the direction of an agency.
And certainly the continuity of operations during a presidential transition would be a mess, as Mr. Levine said. Mr. Devine, you have a comment?
Yes, sir. I think the bottom line is that you'd have, for those employees, a labor force of people whose primary duty is loyalty to the president rather than public service. And, sir, I'm not convinced that this would be limited to 50,000 employees. That's the current roster of jobs that need to be approved by the White House. That roster can be expanded. And further, the text of the executive order that created Schedule F is so open-ended that the limited boundaries are not reliable. The positions of confidential policy determining, policy making, or policy advocating character, well, that includes employees who work on agency regulations, who have discretion in exercising legal functions, who engage in activities covered by the deliberative process, or work for or with anyone who is just 13 or higher. Who else is left?
Very good. Well, I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony personally. I am also a member of the Armed Services Committee and have some questions, and so I'm going to be leaving, but I'm going to leave this hearing in the very capable hands of Senator Hassan, who will now chair this hearing. So again, thank you to our witnesses. We look forward to continuing to work with you. Senator Hassan, you're recognized for your questions and to take the gavel.
Thank you, Chair Peters. I want to thank you and the ranking member for this hearing. I want to thank the witnesses not only for being here today, but for the work that you do. And before I begin my questions, I want to also express my relief that former President Trump is safe after what appears to be a second assassination attempt against him. Political violence goes against everything that we stand for in a democracy, and I am grateful for the law enforcement officers who took swift action and protected him. Turning to the topic of today's hearing, first, I want to thank all the women and men who choose to support our country by working for the federal government. Whether you help seniors navigate Medicaid or Social Security, or stop the flow of illegal drugs and weapons into our country, you all play a critical role in strengthening our nation. So I hope all federal employees who may either be watching or hear about this hearing know that we are grateful for the work that they do. I want to start with a question to you, Ms. Duke. According to analysis by the Partnership for Public Service, more than 70% of the federal workforce serves in defense or national security agencies. Nonpartisan career civil servants at these agencies provide stable expertise and institutional knowledge across presidential administrations and under different political leadership to respond to emergencies to keep our country secure and safe. Converting large numbers of civil servants into political appointees could disrupt this stability, which is especially concerning for our defense and national security programs. So, Ms. Duke, how would converting into political appointees large numbers of our defense and national security personnel impact our homeland and national security in terms of eroding institutional knowledge and expertise?
The mission is carried out by civil servants. And I think, as you said, Senator, the ability to carry out the mission would be eroded by not having enough people doing the mission and not having that institutional knowledge. Many of the career paths in the Homeland Security mission take years to train, develop, and have someone journeyman level so that they can actually perform the functions. And you need that level of stability to effectively carrying out the important missions in our homeland. And that turnover and that chaos that would be created would obviously detriment the capabilities and the skills of the mission workforce.
Well, thank you for that. Now a question to Mr. Devine. The overwhelming majority of federal employees do their work in a nonpartisan manner, seeking to serve their fellow Americans. This isn't only important for our democracy, but it also helps protect the appropriate use of taxpayer dollars. How would increasing the number of political appointees within the federal government undermine data-driven decision-making at federal agencies and jeopardize the impartial use of federal funding?
Senator, it would mean that a number of the accomplishments that whistleblowers have achieved wouldn't have happened, and the course of history would have been changed for the worse instead of for the better. The Pentagon would still be spending exponentially more for procurement than it needs to. We wouldn't have defended our country against the intensified al-Qaeda attack to expanded 9/11 attack in 2003 that whistleblowers stopped. We'd still be having really obscenely more casualties from landmines that are necessary. We would have had a much greater risk of nuclear power accidents at facilities that were accidents waiting to happen. People would be continuing to die from dangerous drugs such as Vioxx, which killed 40,000 elderly Americans before an FDA whistleblower exposed the truth about it. Yeah. The course of history would consistently be changed for the worse instead of for the better without freedom of speech for whistleblowers.
Yeah, and really for federal employees to do their job based on data and the evidence in front of them and be able to voice their concerns impartially.
Well, you know, that's a very significant point, Senator, because most of the people covered by the Whistleblower Protection Act are not pointing fingers or filing charges. Yeah. They're blowing the whistle because that's their jobs.
Right.
It's their jobs to report fraud, waste, and abuse, to expose public health and safety hazards. And they get retaliated against, even under the current system, just for doing their jobs. They'll have no rights under Schedule F.
Right, and even, you know, I think too about a federal employee who's got some civil servant protections, who's getting pressured to adopt one policy or the next, which they know isn't supported, for instance, by evidence, by data. And again, they have the capacity under the current system to push back, even if it's not a terribly political push, but to say, hey, you know, this isn't really what the data supports.
Well, it's thanks to whistleblowers that the truth can trump politics
Yeah.
within public service, and they're indispensable.
Well, thank you for that, and I agree with you, and it's one of the reasons the idea of Schedule F is so concerning to me. Ms. Mattingley, I wanted to round things out with a question to you about Congress's role here in preventing political interference. Earlier this year, the Office of Personnel Management established a transparent procedure for converting career civil servant positions to non-career political appointments. In that policy, the Office of Personnel Management also affirmed existing protections for federal employees so that they can't be removed if and when an employee's position is converted. These policies are an important step toward protecting the federal employee's ability to be objective in their analysis and in carrying out their duties. Are there additional steps that Congress can take to protect the federal workforce and career civil servants from undue political influence?
I think Congress has an important role in continuing to do its oversight on agencies and the work agencies do, as well as looking at some of the root causes that we hear, about Schedule F of not being able to take care of poor performers and hold them accountable, not being able to fire federal employees. If the goal is to actually ensure that agencies work effectively for the citizens, for your constituents, then what we need to do is actually look at the root management causes around this, and Congress and this committee play an important role in looking at the whole talent life cycle, which are part of holding employees accountable,
Right.
hiring, employee development, performance management. And I think tackling some of those systems, making them easier, simpler, more transparent, would be a good step.
Well, thank you for that. That's very helpful, and I look forward to following up with you on that and to following up with all of you. I'm really appreciative of your testimony today, sharing your expertise and your perspective because of your experience and expertise is really important. Our nonpartisan civil service is essential for our government to operate effectively and protect U.S. national security interests. Regardless of the politics of the president in office, the American people should be able to trust that the professionals hired into the civil service are putting the public's interests first and honoring their oath to protect and defend the Constitution. Through legislation and oversight, it is the responsibility of Congress to protect the nonpartisan nature of our dedicated civil service. So with that, I wanted to make sure that everybody knows that the record for this hearing will remain open for 15 days until 5 p.m. on October 2nd, 2024, for the submission of statements and questions for the record. With that, thank you again for being here, and this hearing is now adjourned.